In the world of Minecraft, you can explore undiscovered lands. You can build structures with only your imagination as a limit. You can meet with villagers with whom you can trade. However, you're not exactly doing those things. An avatar under your control is doing those things within the parameters of a program because, well, Minecraft is not real life. It is a video game. It is a vehicle of experiences, a means of expression, and a form of art. This is indeed a controversial and debatable position since I don't simply think that video games can be art, I think that video games is an art medium of its own. This position implies that I think that almost every video game is a form of art, and I do. Yes, even Minecraft. Film critic Roger Ebert states one of the main arguments advanced by those opposing the conception of video games as a form of art. According to him, and I quote, "One obvious difference between art and games is that you can win a game. It has rules, points, objectives, and an outcome. Santiago, his opponent, might cite an immersive game without points or rules, but I would say then it ceases to be a game and becomes a representation of a story, a novel, a play, dance, a film. Those are things you cannot win. You can only experience them." To them I say yes. A story that you experience rather than try to win is intrinsic to art forms like novels, plays, and films. However, it is not what makes them artistic. It is not the fact that they have no rules that makes us consider them art. It is the meaning that they represent, the beauty that they exhibit in their own specific way, according to their medium's strengths. So even if we agree with what he says, that if you experiment with a story that has no rules, points, or objectives, you are not exactly experimenting a video game, this does not allow to say that video games are not art. The only thing we can claim from this argument is that video games are not plays, nor films, nor novels. They are something else. They are their own medium, and like every other medium, they function differently, and it would be wrong to consider them empty of artistic value because of that. In the same way that it would be wrong to dismiss conceptual art as art, because unlike films and plays and novels, their artistic value is not perceptible with the senses. It would also be wrong to dismiss poetry as art because unlike paintings, it uses the structure of language instead of forms and colors. It just doesn't make sense to devalue a medium because of its differences with other mediums. Obviously, every new medium shares similarities with other existing medium, but they also possess specific aptitudes not found in every other medium. Even if video games initially appeared as entertainment devices, they evolved into something that has, as a new medium of art, a specific way of deploying its articity. At the total opposite of what Mr. Ebert thinks, I think that the format of video games where rules and objectives are employed doesn't diminish their articity, rather it is what makes them a specific medium of art. Heck, even Marcel Duchamp considered chess the most simplistic form of rules and objectives based board game, a form of art. But exactly, what is this video game's specific way of deploying its articity? Why does the presence of rules and objectives present an important aspect of their identity as an art medium? I think that in his video, Why George R.R. Martin is Wrong, a defense of video game, The Closer Look makes compelling arguments to answer that question. However, there's one example in particular that I find especially convincing. He talks about this scene in Battlefield 1 where the player holds the place of a tank pilot during the First World War near some trenches where devastation already happened and where enemies are running away to safety. Without much directives, but acting like there are, because in video games there generally are, the player is implicitly asked to shoot those unnamed enemies. Much like an actual soldier during this war, there's a moment where you come across an enemy who, unlike the others, is sitting amongst the ruined terrain. His palms on his head, his whole body shaking, he appears defenseless, scared like a child. As the player who is immersed in this experience of being a soldier, you feel that you are expected to shoot those people with an enemy uniform. However, when you come across this particular enemy who poses no threat and who is humanized by the context, the choice might cross your mind. Do I kill him? What if I don't? I am expected to do so. But is this the right thing to do? This position of emotional choice is one of the ways that video games have to deploy their artistic value in a particularly powerful manner. Like the closer look says, the scene could have been in a movie where you see the enemy and then the person aiming at them, hesitating, and then probably lowering their weapon. And in his exact words, it would have been powerful, but nowhere near as powerful because in the film the viewer is observing a character going through the emotions. We are being told what the character feels, but in the game, you are not witnessing someone feeling emotions. You are the one feeling those emotions as you go through the emotional roller coaster that character or the real people in this situation would have gone through. In a way, this scene uses the rules that video games usually deploy and that we expect to further our immersion, which is a core component of video games' strengths as an artistic medium and places us in a deeply emotional situation, one that other mediums would not have handled as powerfully. Another good example, I think, is DEFCON, the 2006 real-time strategy game. In this game, where every player is against each other, you control a group of nations that possess a nuclear arsenal. However, your units, your military, appear as simple dots on the world map. The whole visual interface tries to disconnect you from the humans, even though they are fictive, that are under your control. This is much like the same interface that a government would use to organize a war. I mean, the leaders are not out there on the battlefield, they don't directly witness the dead, the victims, the destruction. As a typical match develops, the conflict evolves. Initially, the combat is fought on a small scale with infantry. Eventually, tanks and the air force are deployed and inevitably, in the end, you can access your nuclear arsenal to try to wipe the opponents and win the war. What's special about this is that the position that you incarnate exists. Real-world leaders with access to nuclear warfare exist, and the capacity that you have to generate total annihilation by starting a nuclear warfare is also something that those real-world leaders have the capacity to do. And they also have this power accessible to them in the same way that it is to you. It is a simple tool to win a conflict that you can use with total personal safety. No rule in the game forces you to use your nukes. Only the context does. Do you want to wait until your opponent uses them first and gain the upper hand? No? Then you gotta use them first. And I mean, why wouldn't you? I mean, from your perspective, the only loss from a nuclear warfare are dots on the world map. Again, much like the perspective of the real world leaders whose concept you take the role of. This experience, only possible in the medium of a game, is important because it lets the player feel and realize the incommensurable threat that nuclear warfare poses. It lets you feel how a distant leader whose personal safety is not at risk would simply prefer not to lose the conflict before his opponent does, and that's it. The thought process that could lead to the destruction of the world as we know it is no longer alien because of the experience that the video game DEFCON provides. Video games are art because of the position that they put us in. It is an artistic experience to explore a world conceived with rules, design, limits, and a context in the same way that it is an artistic experience to listen to music and feel the atmosphere change as the melody creates new ambiances, or to look at a painting and feel the emotions that the forms have to offer. Considering video games as art forced me to have a strange realization. When I played Minecraft for the first time, I built a house. A shit house, but I loved it, enough to decorate it. So I went to the wiki to see the list of buildable items as well as their recipes. I stumbled across the painting item, so I built it and hung it onto a wall of the house. There it was, a painting, a thing generally conceived as a work of art, an artistic object existing there in this virtual world, this virtual work of art. So when I looked at the painting to contemplate it, I asked myself, am I having an artistic experience inside an artistic experience? Can this painting provide the exact same artistic experience as a real painting, even if it exists within the parameters of another different work of art that is from a different medium? In his treatise, Critical Reflection on Poetry and Painting, 1719, L'Abbé Dubos points out that poetry and painting deploy aesthetic differently. Poetry excels at conveying emotion and aesthetic through the representation of action, whereas painting excels at conveying emotions and aesthetic through the representation of figures. And in his book On the Beautiful in Music, 1854, Edward Hanslick argues that music differs from other mediums because it does not represent. Rather, its aesthetic exists only within itself. Its beauty resides in its own disconnected higher structure. The beautiful in music does not aestheticize an idea or an object that exists outside of it. It simply is, purely and aesthetically. So, different mediums deploy aesthetic differently. They all have their own way of being artistic. These ways can be very dissimilar, yet they all are artistic. Now, I'm not saying that a work of art has to be a part of a certain medium to be considered a work of art. What I'm saying is that mediums, even if a non-exhaustive tool of classifying art, can be accountable for an immense number of works of art. And since they propose intrinsic structures that are extremely diverse, it shows us well how different are some forms that art can take. It justifies how two things like a painting and a symphony can share almost nothing in their structures and characteristics, yet they both have what we call aesthetic. Yet, being from different mediums, they both deploy this aesthetic in almost mutually exclusive different ways. But then if different artistic mediums express art differently, it makes me wonder, how does it work for the product of a certain medium of art when it exists only within the borders of a different product from a different medium of art? I'm talking about an object that can only be accessed through the consumption of a different object of art from a different medium. Thus, its way of deploying aesthetic becomes swallowed by the larger works of art way of doing it, making it lose its specificity and its integrity as a work of art of its own. Can it still convey its own ontologically independent artistic experience? Is this object still a work of art in its own right? Or is it just the regional aesthetic aspect of the larger work of art? Are Minecraft's paintings as real works of art as real-world paintings? Before we start, I'll explain a few terms that are necessary to understand in order to understand the essay. They are necessary to be familiar with, because if you're not, well, you won't know what the fuck I'm talking about. And different philosophers might define them differently, so we need to be on the same page about them. Definition 1. Ontology. Ontology is the study of the being and of the way that it exists as such being with logical and rational concepts as tools. It aims to understand a being's manière d'être, its way to be. It examines how a given studied object, here art, is categorized in relation to other existing entities and where it stands towards reality. Is the object material, abstract, spiritual, or else? When does the object's identity is and when isn't it? Does it exist only as the result of the relationship with or between other objects, or can it be by itself? Those are all questions that are from the realm of ontology. Definition 2. Aesthetic. Aesthetic is the part of an object that conveys an aesthetic experience, an artistic reaction. It is the thing within an object that is the condition that makes it art. Without the aesthetic parts, the object wouldn't be art anymore, whereas you can change every other aspect of the object that isn't aesthetic, and the object would still be art. This part is not physical, however. It is abstract. To prove this point, Arthur Rondeau proposes a good thought experiment: the monochrome gallery. The monochrome gallery is a fictional exposition which includes 4 paintings. One is called Red Square. One is called Red Square Moscow. One is a still life reference called Tablecloth. And the final one is called Kierkegaard's Mood. Have you noticed something weird about those works of art? If you have an eyesight, you notice that they are physically the same thing. From a physical standpoint, those 4 works of art have absolutely no differences. They are exact replicas of each other. All of those works of art have the same physical identity, yet they all have a different aesthetic identity. They all deploy articity in a different way. The first one is an abstract painting, the second one an artistic depiction of the Red Square in Moscow, the third one is about the commonality of the tablecloth in still lives, and the final one is sort of an abstract expressionism work of art that tries to convey a specific philosophical emotion. This shows that aesthetic is not a physical part of a work of art. Rather, it is something in the theoretical atmosphere of a work of art. Another good example is Fontaine by Duchamp. This work of art is physically the same thing as a common urinal in a washroom. It could even be in the washroom of the very museum that exposes Fontaine. However, we consider one a work of art and one not. Again, because it is the idea, the theoretical atmosphere of the object that holds the aesthetic. Definition 3. Articity. I personally often use it as a substitute for aesthetic, just to make sure that what I'm referring to is not confused with the common definition of aesthetic, which is different from the philosophical definition that I use and that pretty much translates to beauty. Anyways, by articity, I refer to the specific thing that makes art art. Art. Art is a notoriously difficult thing to define, and every philosopher of art disagrees on its definition. So I'll explain which definition I prefer, and if you disagree, well, it's okay. Now, to define art, the way it was defined changed a lot throughout history, as civilizations and philosophers had an evolutive relationship with it. I would also claim that it ontologically changed as well. First, we had the Socrates, who hated it and said it was pretty much only representations, and representations aren't as real objects, so it's shit. And then Aristotle said, nah, it's fine. It's representations, but it's representations that helps educate about ethical concepts and such. So it's cool, actually. In the Middle Age, there were these weird aesthetic theological theories, but in the Renaissance and modern era, theories started getting more complex. However divergent, almost every aesthetic theory of art definition back then was based on 3 presuppositions. 1. Art is made by an artist who incorporates an artistic dimension in an object. 2. Every artistic object is the result of an artistic action, a notable transformation. 3. A work of art necessarily operates in a specific medium whose entire characteristics are artistic ones. Then, contemporary artists threw all of it in the garbage. Like sociologist Nancy Hynek affirms, a change of paradigm has been operated with the arrival of contemporary artists. No longer a work of art had to be the creation of an artist. No longer a work of art was an artistically transformed object, and no longer was a work of art's aesthetic determined by one precise established artistic medium. The business of art definition was bankrupt. Everything had to be started all over again to incorporate the new way of doing art in the global definition. Some philosophers now argue that we cannot even define art anymore. Some say that maybe we can. I don't know. Obviously, some are still trying to propose definitions, despite it all. One of them, Arthur Danto, offers the definition that I think is the best because it checks all the boxes that a good art definition has to have. It is coherent, comprehensive, and exhaustive. I'll summarize it so that we can all understand what I actually consider a work of art. Danto starts by asking himself this question: what makes something a work of art? Now, to answer the question, he decides to analyze the conceptual difference between an object that is a work of art and an identical object that isn't. In a way, he wants to subtract the characteristics from the object that is not a work of art to the one that is a work of art. That way, the only remaining characteristics will be artistic or aesthetic characteristics. He finds that the particularities that the work of art have exist in the theoretical atmosphere. They exist conceptually. Now, he goes and tries to define those characteristics. For Danto, there are three precise characteristics that makes something art. 1. A work of art has an aboutness. 2. A work of art is made by interpretation. 3. A work of art is an incorporated metaphor. 1. A work of art has an aboutness. A work of art is about something. Even if it appears to lack content, the lack is content. It is about the lack of content, about nothing. It is never devoid of content, of aboutness. It is supposed to mean something. 2. A work of art is made by interpretation. A work of art has characteristics that are intentionally interpretable to understand its aboutness. Certain elements of the work of art are to be interpreted and some aren't. After interpreting a work of art, we decipher its aboutness. For example, the colors and forms of a painting are to be interpreted, but the size of the painting might have to be in some cases, but not in all of them. The idea behind the work of art dictates what elements have to be interpreted, but necessarily some elements have to be for it to be a work of art. A work of art is an incorporated metaphor. This is more complicated. A work of art is a form of representation, a metaphor. But it is different from another form of representation because not only does it represent a concept or an idea or else, it also does it in a way that takes into consideration its very position in the way that it represents it. A work of art obliges us to see the representation in a specific, intended, and interpretable way. So the work of art knows the position that it has towards the represented because it is that position that it intends to put us in to interpret it and to understand how it deploys its aesthetic. In a way, we cannot exactly explain or paraphrase a work of art because the explanation loses this aspect of the work of art, which is to understand its own position. When we perceive the work of art, we perceive its ontological position and its perception of its own position. This doesn't happen when we receive the paraphrase of the work of art because the explanation has an ontological different position than the work of art. On the other side, a different form of representation can be understood with a paraphrase without losing any meaning. I can explain that sacramental bread is the body of the Christ for the Christian church. You don't have to experiment it to understand, because it is a simple metaphor, not an incorporated metaphor. So it is those three characteristics that form the definition of art: having an aboutness, necessitating interpretation, and being an incorporated metaphor. Aesthetic experience. It is the reaction that one has when in contact with aesthetics. However, the experience is not sufficient to determine what is art, because this experience can be falsely attributed. Alright, definitions are over. Now, I know that some of you are thinking, isn't art within art a common occurrence? And why make a special case of Minecraft's paintings? First of all, yes, it is common. There is music in films, in theaters, in video games. There often are descriptions of paintings in literature. There is poetry in music with lyrics. There is music in dance spectacles, etc. And that's why I think a philosophical analysis of this is pertinent. Now, why make a special case of Minecraft's paintings? Well, because I thought about it, obviously, and I realized that they simply do represent a very particular or ontological case of art within art. So, after thinking about the ontological nuances of a work of art within a work of art from a different medium, I distinguish 4 main types of art within art of a different medium occurrences, or apparent occurrences. I could have included my consideration of art within art of the same medium, but it's not as much interesting ontologically. So I'll present each one of them and discuss the specifics of the ontology of the aesthetic that they represent. I'll start by giving a broad definition. That might sound complicated for each one of them, but I'll explain it right after, so no worries. Oh, also, I nicknamed all of them so that they are easier to remember. Let's start. Extractable art. The products of a medium of art that were intended in their creation to be complementary to another product of another medium in order to generate the aesthetics of a larger work of art while retaining their specific medium's integrity. What I mean by that is a creation that has been built according to the principles and the method of craft from a specific artistic medium, but that has been conceived with the goal in mind to complement the aesthetic of another creation. However, unlike the crafts from some other categories, they retain their craft's specific medium structure when providing an aesthetic experience. Practically, OSTs from a movie or a video game are examples of occurrences of that category. They have been conceived according to the structure of the medium of music, and they deploy their aesthetic according to this specific medium, even if they have been conceived with the complementarity to the product of another craft in mind, in order to generate the aesthetic of the large movie or video game. The fact that they aren't meant to be a part of the aesthetic of the product of a medium that isn't music don't make them music any less. To continue with the example of movies' OSTs, the movie's articity is characterized by the complementarity of the OSTs, the cinematography, the editing, the acting, etc. Of all of those elements, OSTs are the only one which is a product that comes from an integrally independent medium, which is music. And even though the OST's aesthetics is not meant to be integrally independent, it retains the particularity of its medium's structure, which again is music. It still is rhythmic, it still is perceptible by the audition, it still has a pitch, a height, it still conveys an ambiance, an atmosphere, etc. It is usually not intended to be a work of art of its own, but can be when extracted from its original context because of the way it retains its medium specificity. For example, let's imagine someone who consumes a song from your favorite movie or video game's OST without accessing it through the scene or the credits or else from the movie or video game that it was meant to complement. Let's also imagine that they don't have the knowledge of this aspect of the song. They don't know it was originally part of a movie or a video game. I don't think that it's controversial to say that they will receive it as a song, as music, as a work of art from the medium of music, and not like an incomplete work, even though it originally was meant to be, in a way, an incomplete work. A craft that is whole when joined with other crafts. Now, imagine if a song from an OST was perceived as such, not only by one person, but by everyone. This is a thought experiment. Imagine a person single-handedly making a movie. The script, the editing, the music, everything. In one scene of the movie, 2 guys are fighting and the song that goes with the scene is a beatbox. A beatbox made by the person making the movie and specifically for
the movie. Now, the guy making the movie accidentally uploads the song on SoundCloud. It is a huge success. It gets trillions of views. It is considered one of the best musical pieces of the 21st century. Now, in this example, even if the song wasn't meant to be a complete work on its own, it is for society, for almost everyone, but the guy who made it. It is received as a complete work of art. If it was a painting, it would be in a museum, even though it was not meant to be. It is a work of art despite the intentions behind it. However, if such a craft from a specific medium is gained such an independent identity from a cultural perception, making it a work of art of its own, what happens to it ontologically when it is consumed back in its original context? Let me use a real-world example to make it clear. The song Footloose. It was made for the movie Footloose. However, you can hear it in commercials or on the radio. People listen to this song and sometimes don't even know that it was supposed to be a part of a larger aesthetic, the aesthetic of the movie of the same name. We can safely say that the song has gained a certain artistic independence from its original context. When received with the famous scene of Kevin Bacon dancing, it was only original part of the larger aesthetic of the whole movie, but it is now often received without this context. It now expresses its aesthetic independently. Now, if a public who received the song as a whole product, possessing its own independent aesthetic, listens to the Footloose movie back or for the first time, does this song, as it appears in the scene from the movie, gets pushed back into its position of complementarity with the other aesthetic aspect of the larger movie, or does it retain its gained aesthetic independence? None of those options. I don't think that in this situation there is such a thing as the original context anymore. You see, when this public, for which the song has a complete integrity, receives the aesthetic from the whole movie, it receives the movie's integral aesthetic. However, when it receives the scene of Kevin Bacon dancing with the song Footloose, it receives more than just the movie's integral aesthetic. It receives the movie's aesthetics, which partly includes certain aspects of the song as it is complementary to the visual of Kevin Bacon dancing, and it reflects on the character's mindset. But it does also receive another aesthetic aspect of the song, one that it had when on its own. I don't know what the Footloose song might convey on its own to this public, but maybe the nostalgia of an era because of its 80s vibe, the simply catchy lyrics and rhythm, or even the emotions of love towards dancing. During this scene, the public receives the movie's aesthetics as well as the song's aesthetic, which is partly complementary to the visual of the scene in which it is, but not entirely. So the original context doesn't exist anymore because what the song gained in aesthetics, since it's been extracted from its original context, is not lost. The public still receives it, even if it is consumed through the movie. Now, since the original context of the song is to be entirely complementary to the scene, we cannot say that for this public, the original context still exists. I spent a lot of time using the example of OSTs for this category, but other types of crafts can be included in this category. A sculpture made specifically for an installation, a painting used in a performance, etc. Those works have been made specifically for the complementarity of other aspects of the aesthetic of a larger work of art, yet they remain a craft that's specific to an art medium, and so deploys aesthetic differently from the other parts of the work of art in which they are, so they can be consumed independently and differently. Before we go to the next category, I want to mention a difference that exists between certain occurrences of crafts that fall into this category. The difference doesn't affect the large categorization, but it's still an ontological one. The difference is about a specific craft's relationship with reality and fictionality. The difference creates two ontologically distinct subcategories. There are occurrences where a craft from this category exists within the fictive universe depicted in the work of art that the craft complements. They would be called diegetic. There are other occurrences where the craft only exists as the aesthetic complement that's part of the larger work of art, they would be extra diegetic. Simply put, some crafts exist only meta, whereas some don't. For example, the Empire's March exists within the Star Wars universe. We hear it played in a piece of Empire's propaganda in a scene in the movie Rogue One from the Star Wars franchise. On the other side, the song Skyfall from the James Bond movie of the same name doesn't exist within the James Bond universe. It is played during the credits. This being said, there is this weird case of songs in musicals. I don't always know in which subcategory to place them. Like, do the people in Mamma Mia know that they communicate by singing, by performing works of art? Do the characters in operas live in a universe where communication is intrinsically musical and where musicality is synonymous with communication? In which case, the songs that are performed by the actors, singers, aren't art in the fictive world that they act in. They would be just a type of communication there. They would be art, music, only in the meta, outside the work of art for the public. Or maybe the music exists as art in their universe, but it is socially acceptable to communicate with those works of art instead of talking, in which case the songs would exist as art within the fictive universe. But does this difference even matter? Does it even influence the manifestation of the articity of a work of art? Does it affect its aboutness? Probably. Though for sure there is an ontological difference because it does change the degree of fictionality of a work of art, but I won't go into too much analysis of the implications of those particular subcategories as differences in this essay, as it won't leave enough time for the analysis of the other main categories. Maybe I'll analyze this question of the relationship between degree of fictionality and aesthetic in another video. Now, the second category of occurrences. Nickname art lookalike. They are the representations of the products of a medium of art that were intended in their creation to be complementary to another product of another medium in order to generate the aesthetic of a larger work of art. I chose the word representation of the product of a medium because in the way that it ontologically exists, it doesn't share the necessary characteristics of the medium that it depicts to be considered the product of this medium, even if it seems like it. I'll make myself clearer with an example. Squidward's painting in SpongeBob would fit in that category. It has been conceived to seem like the product of a medium within the aesthetics of a larger medium, but doesn't exist as a real product of this medium in its relationship towards reality. Squidward's painting has been conceived as a part of the show SpongeBob. It exists within the SpongeBob's universe as a painting. For such purpose, it has been conceived to be like a painting. It is suggested that it has been painted. However, by existing within the aesthetic of a product of a different medium, the crafts from this category, just like Squidward's paintings, cannot possess in the real world an integrity that's specific to the medium that they depict. Unlike the crafts from the first category that retained their medium-specific characteristic, even when inside the aesthetic of a larger work of art, Squidward's painting is not a real painting. It's on a digitally drawn representation of a fictive canvas. It doesn't age, it has no physical properties whatsoever. Squidward's painting cannot be a painting when within the aesthetic of the larger work of art that is the show SpongeBob. From an ontological point of view, crafts from this category aren't works of art. They seem like they could possess a certain distinctive identity because we associate them with a different medium from the rest of the larger work of art that they are a part of, since they do depict a different medium. And when consuming a representation of fiction, we have, as a reflex, to put aside our disbelief. We would always be pulled out of the consumption of a work that depicts fiction if we were to constantly remind ourselves of the fictionality of it. We accept that it is fiction, but we agree to trust the legitimacy of the depicted universe in order to appreciate it. So when we see a depiction of a painting in SpongeBob, we might implicitly have the reflex to refer to it as a painting. I'm probably not breaking any grounds by saying it, but it is not actually a painting. It doesn't possess any characteristics of a real painting. Now, if it isn't a painting, what is it? Can it still be described as a work of art of its own? I would say no. Nothing would justify it being anything else than simply a regional part of the TV show's own aesthetic. It doesn't deploy an aesthetic that is different from the rest of the show. It ontologically has the same characteristics as the rest of the show's visuals, and like every other element, it is a narrative tool before anything else. The show's world is a fiction that's created and is meant to be consumed by and with a narrative. It is narrative, it is a story. Therefore, every other element there is not random. They all have been chosen to be where they are in order to contribute to the general aboutness, which is a narrative aboutness. Squidward's painting is a narrative element. It conveys information about the character and makes the story progress. It doesn't convey more than that. Its aboutness is limited to its position within the story. It is its context. So it is not a work of art. It is an art look-alike. It looks like art, but it isn't. I mean, we do have the reflex to accept it as a painting and not as a depiction of a random colored filled canvas deprived of aesthetics in order to buy into the fictional universe that we are consuming. If we react differently to it, it is because we are victims of our suspension of disbelief habit. However, Squidward's painting doesn't exist as an independent work of art, and it is not supposed to emanate the aesthetic of such a work. Its aesthetic is only about the purpose it serves in the larger context of the show. Like every other element of the show, it has no specific ontological identity except an illusory one. Now, this question could be studied more profoundly, but it would require a meta-aesthetic analysis of the way consciousness works, and yeah, that's too chunky of a subject to tackle here now. I'm not saying never though. Now, lastly, if it was to be recreated as a product with the characteristics of the medium that it represents in real life, say an actual painting, would it be an actual work of art? Yes, it could. However, it would not be the same object, merely a reference. So the original representation is not a work of art and will never be, unless we learn that the SpongeBob's universe is not fictional and an actual place in our world and that the show is a docu-series. Other examples of occurrences of this category could be the depiction of a statue that doesn't exist represented in a painting, the architecture of a fictional building in a video game, etc. In short, the ontological characteristics of works from this category are that they are not intended to be works of art on their own, and they are not and cannot be even when extracted from their original context. Third category, nicknamed malleable art. They are the products of a certain medium of art that were not intended in their creation to be complementary to another product of another medium in order to generate the aesthetic of a larger work of art, but are used as such and ontologically retain their medium's integrity. In other words, a work of art from a specific medium that has been created as a work of art on its own, but that is used to contribute to the aesthetic of another work of art and ontologically keeps the characteristics of the medium from which it was conceived, even when it exists within the border of the other work of art from a different medium. The most common occurrence of this category is songs that were created as just that, songs, but that are now part of a movie or a TV show. They were created with the medium of music, and even though they are used as a partial conveyor of aesthetic for a larger work of art, they still exist as products of the medium of music. Although even if they convey aesthetic in a specific way that's different from the rest of the medium, they lose the integral aesthetics of their origin when in this context. Let's use a precise example to understand better the ontology of the works of this category. Fortunate Son is a protest song against the Vietnam War that has been written and recorded by CCR in 1969 during the Vietnam War, and it remains culturally very much associated with this event in US history. It tells the story of injustice in the military draft where fortunate kids, politicians' kids, rich people's kids,
manage to avoid the duty of going to war, whereas kids from poorer family don't have much choice but to go to war. Part of the song's aboutness is the contemplation of this social injustice from the point of view of a draftee that deplores the situation. I ain't no fortunate son, he says. Now, it is also used in the movie Forrest Gump in a scene where two important characters arrive in Vietnam during a conflict. However, then, the song doesn't hold its integral aesthetic, because the original message about injustice is not what the song conveys when accessed through the aesthetic of the movie. Its aboutness is different when in this context. I mean, opposing the Vietnam War is not what the movie is about, not even what this scene is about. Forrest Gump actually enlists in the military. He is not drafted. We are implicitly asked to forget about the part of the song's aesthetic that criticizes the social injustice of the drafting process in order to let the song emanate another aesthetic than what it was originally about. The aesthetic that the song now emanates is simply Vietnam War vibe. The reason this song was chosen to convey this aesthetic, even though that's not what it is supposed to convey, is because despite its social position, the song is culturally and historically emblematic of the Vietnam War era. Now, since the movie Forrest Gump was released in the 90s, about 20 years after the end of the Vietnam War, the aesthetic that it needed from a song in the scene of the Vietnam War was one that reflects a throwback to the era that the scene wants to represent, so that makes sense that they chose this song. But since this aspect of the song exists independently from the movie, the fact that it is emblematic of the Vietnam War era, it means the song's aesthetic is not absorbed by the aesthetic of the movie. Its aboutness, despite being deployed in a way that is not its original way, remains ontologically independent from the movie's aboutness. So we can safely say that it still exists as a work of art in its own right. Now, to be precise, even though the presence of a work of art of this category in another work of art changes its aboutness, it isn't the only thing that changes a work of art's aboutness. History does it too. For example, ancient Greece statues were initially used to convey the feeling of the real presence of the god that they depicted. That was their aesthetic, their aboutness. But now, when in a museum, their aboutness is different. Their aesthetic properties now convey the beauty and the mysterious aspect of the culture of an ancient civilization. Their aesthetic no longer conveys a godly presence. History changed their aesthetic, just like the works of art from this category are changed by their presence in the larger work. So works from this category are works of art, and they remain as such even when inside a larger work of art. They remain works of art because they still have a way of deploying aesthetics that is different from how the larger work of art does. They have an aboutness that is not exactly the same as the larger work of art, even though they work together. So since we can say that they have an aboutness, and that they aren't only a regional aesthetic part of the larger work of art, they have to be considered works of art even in the context of being part of the larger work of art. Although despite remaining works of art, they have a different aesthetic in the context than they originally did, even though they share the same perceptible properties. They no longer have the same aboutness. If we follow Danto's view of art, we have to admit that they are different works of art when in the context of a larger work of art, since they have a different aesthetic. Fortunate Son is no longer the song about the injustice of the military drafting, it is now the song about having a Vietnam War era vibe. Other occurrences of this category could be a digital photo that is freeze-framed in a movie, or an existing architecturally artistic building in an installation. What has been said about the example of music and Fortunate Son in this category would also apply to those examples. They all lose their original aesthetic, but retain their medium's integrity, and exist still as integral works of art when existing within another work of art from a different medium's aesthetic. Fourth category, nicknamed representation of a work of art. They're the products of a medium of art that were not intended in their creation to be complementary to another product of another medium in order to generate the aesthetic of a larger work of art, but are used as such
and don't ontologically retain their medium's integrity in the process and become representations of work of art instead of actual works of art. Some examples could be an existing sculpture represented in a painting, or a drawing, a digitized architecturally artistic real-world building in a video game or shown in a movie, or again a painting in a movie, etc. Like the works of art from the third category, the works from this category lose their original aesthetic when in the context of a larger work of art. They no longer have their original aboutness. However, their new aboutness is a context. It doesn't retain any independent aspect. Another difference is that they also lose their medium's integrity. The result is that unlike works from the third category, they are no longer works of art, rather representation of works of art. For example, let's take the Notre Dame Cathedral in Assassin's Creed Unity. The original construction is undoubtedly a work of architectural art. It mixes the use of empirical scientific tools and aesthetic ambitions, in this case grandeur and magnificence, to organize a space with physics, sometimes as an ally but mostly as an obstacle. This is what architecture is as an art medium. This is what it is about. This is why the Notre Dame Cathedral is a work of art. Except it's not, when it is digitized in the fictional world of Assassin's Creed. See, it doesn't anymore offer the wonder of showing how one can deploy creativity to aesthetically organize material and space in a sophisticated and complex structure, often defying gravity altogether. In the Assassin's Creed's world, it is beautiful, sure, but it doesn't offer what the medium of architecture offers. It is no longer a work of architectural art. You can tour it as you would in real life, but the impressiveness of the grandeur of the cathedral can only be achieved by imagining its real-world counterpart that really reflects the genius of managing to build it with the real-world challenges. It is, in a way, a reference to the original building. Now, if it is not a work of architectural art, could it still be considered a work of art, but from a different medium? Well, no. Sure, it has aesthetics, but its only independent aesthetic exists in the real building, not in the digitized version that we're talking about. The digitized version only indirectly possesses those aesthetic properties because it references them. Now, the only aesthetic that it directly has is the aesthetic that it has as a regional part of the video game's aesthetic. The aesthetic of Assassin's Creed Unity. Let me explain. The aesthetic of Assassin's Creed Unity, its aboutness, I would argue, is mainly making us feel like we are doing something important and cool in the world in a special time and place in history. Sure, it has other aspects, such as any narratively driven work of art, but this could be the core aesthetic, I'd say. Now, this video game, as any work of art, is trying to deploy this aesthetic goal in the best that it can. Every part of it, its world building, its level design, its AI, its characters, its writing, are all working together to better deploy this aesthetic. These elements aren't works of art. They are, aesthetically speaking, regional parts of the game's aesthetic, which is the work of art. They don't possess and aren't meant to possess an ontologically independent aboutness that's aiming at something else than benefiting the game's aesthetic. The representation of the Notre Dame Cathedral also exists as such element. It's a regional part of the Assassin's Creed work of art. It exists as part of a world that has an aesthetic goal, and it is meant to, and it does, serve this goal. Even though it represents a work of art with its own aesthetic, the aesthetic that it directly has is not the one of the original, nor does it possess its own independent aesthetic. It has the one of the video game from which it is a part of, only on a smaller scale. It is only a regional part of the whole game's aesthetic, much like the Mona Lisa's dress. Even if it depicted a real dress that was part of the era's fashion, and we consider fashion an art form, when in the painting, it is only a part of the painting's aesthetic. It serves the same purpose, the same general aboutness as all of the other painted elements. It ontologically adapts entirely to its new context. Philosopher Nelson Goodman differentiates holographic arts and autographic arts. Holographic art don't have authenticity as an aesthetic property,
Movies typically are holographic art because whenever I see a movie, and no matter on which specific DVD, very dated example, I know, but it does a good job at explaining the concept, it is always the same movie with the same aesthetic properties. The aesthetic is in the experience. It is not in the authentic physical support of the experience. On the other hand, holographic art has authenticity as an aesthetic property. The original of any given work of art has a specific aesthetic that a reproduction doesn't. The condition of creation of the original is essential to its aboutness. An example would be The Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. The original has an artistic value that a print of the same image doesn't have. The way the original was made is artistic and specific to itself. Why am I talking about that? It is because I think that one of the ontological nuances of the aesthetic of the occurrences of works of art within works of art from this category share a similarity with one of the ontological nuances of a reproduction of an autographic work of art. A reproduced autographic work of art is not a work of art of its own if it aims at reproducing, obviously. LHOOQ Rasé by Duchamp is in a way a copy of Mona Lisa, but it is still a work of art of its own because it aims to and successfully deploy aesthetic in a different way, even if sensorially imperceptible from the original that it copies. Now, this example is not what I'm talking about here. What I am talking about here is a reproduction of an autographic work of art in the sense that it tries to mimic the aesthetic of the original. Now, like occurrences of this category, autographic art reproduction can appear to convey the same aesthetic as the original, although they don't. And if you feel like they do, it is because they make you think of the original, and you indirectly receive the aesthetic of the original by thinking of it with the reproduction as a support to imagination. When looking at a copy of Mona Lisa, whose aesthetic is partly found in its authenticity, in the way that Leonardo da Vinci specifically painted it, well, you don't directly get the whole aesthetic that it is supposed to deploy. If you in fact receive the aesthetic experience of being amazed by the way the work of art was painted, it is by association with the original, and I would say with the cultural obsession about the original. It's also part of its aesthetic. In the same way, if you look at the representation of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Assassin's Creed, it might appear to deploy the same aesthetic marvel as the original one for you. If it does, it is not because the Assassin's Creed digitized construction really deploys the same aesthetic, it is by association to the original. You imagine and contemplate the aesthetic of the original because the representation successfully mimics it. You feel its marvelous grandeur, its magnificence, because you think about how a real entity like the Notre Dame would be in real life when you see the digitized version. Before going to the next category, again, what has been said of this example also applies to other examples of this category, like the ones that I mentioned while presenting this fourth category. What links them and make them a category is, to summarize, the fact that they are works of art represented within another work of art, and that they lose their medium's integrity in the process, as well as the aesthetic of the original, which is replaced by the aesthetic of the larger work, only on a regionally contributive scale. Fifth category, nicknamed Minecraft paintings. Minecraft paintings might not be the only type of occurrence from this category, but it is the only one that I found, and that's why I named the category that way. So to define them, they are the product of a medium that was not intended in its creation to be complementary to another product of another medium in order to generate the aesthetic of a larger work of art, but it is used as such, and even though it loses its medium's integrity, it ontologically remains a work of art in the process, although a different one. Slightly resembles the occurrences of the third category. They too were not created to be a part of a larger work of art, and they too remain works of art even when in this context. The difference is that works from this fifth category lose their medium's integrity like works from the fourth category when they are part of a larger work of art, even if they remain works of art. They remain works of art but become different works of art that don't even possess their original medium's integrity.
In his video, Who Made the Minecraft Paintings and What Do They Say About the Game, which I very much recommend, SolarSense says that Minecraft feels empty in the sense that the vastness of the world makes everything you can see in a playthrough feel very small, like a tiny, unimportant part of the world. He also says that Minecraft's paintings add to this feeling of emptiness by deploying a creepy aesthetic. I agree with this. I mean, what's creepier than the void, than emptiness? Creepiness and emptiness seem to go hand in hand. And they do, so it makes sense that Minecraft paintings feel like they belong in Minecraft's universe. The game and them have common aesthetic elements. But what exactly feels creepy about Minecraft paintings? Well, none of them almost have any friendly elements in them. Skeletons, spiders, and dark tones that feel empty are common in their composition. However, those elements were part of the original paintings made by Christopher Zetterstrand. They are part of the original aesthetic, the paintings that were incorporated in Minecraft. They were part of these works of art before they were put in Minecraft. So in a way, the aesthetic deployment of the paintings in Minecraft is working differently than the other elements of the game. They deploy an aesthetic that is not exclusively meant to contribute to the game's general aesthetic. They deploy an aesthetic that was meant to be deployed even before being part of the game, even though it fits the game's general aesthetic well. They have an aspect of independence in relation to the aesthetic of the game to their aesthetic, which makes them different from the other elements of the game. Because of that, I would say that they still are works of art, and I think it's pretty easy to agree given the context of their incorporation to the larger work of art. I mean, the way that they are incorporated in the larger work of art doesn't narratively force a new interpretation of them. With my example of the third category, Fortunate Son in Forrest Gump, it was clear that the movie intended us to trade a part of the song's original aesthetic for a new contextual aesthetic to better fit the scene in which it was. But now with Minecraft's paintings, there is no narrative that tries to mold our way of perceiving the works of art's aesthetic. The paintings do not appear in a cutscene or during a certain situation where they are used to convey a precise vibe, unlike Squidward's paintings in the second category. They are also not the possession of some NPC that the game wants to give information about through the paintings. They are presented as paintings, just paintings. Just like the original ones are in the real world, they are meant to exist by themselves and to suffice themselves as art should. They are meant to be gazed at, to be aesthetic, artistic, etc. They are presented as works of art within the internal logic and aesthetic of the larger work of art, which is Minecraft. They are works of art, although not the same works of art than the original. Obviously, they are different. First of all, well, they aren't exactly paintings anymore. They lost a lot of necessary conditions that would make them paintings. They aren't painted, they are digitally rendered. You can't see any brushes trace on them. Also, if you compare them to the originals, you'll see that most shapes on them weren't initially pixelated like they are when in Minecraft. I say most because, interestingly, some shapes, like the fire on those ones, were initially pixelated on the paintings. This is another element that makes these work of art's aesthetic different in Minecraft. In the real world, the originals have the cohabitation of traditional forms with pixelated forms on a canvas as part of their aesthetic. This superposition of very different types of form is aesthetic. Now, this is not exactly the case when they are in Minecraft's world. This cohabitation is no longer part of their aesthetic. Not to say that they lack something when in Minecraft, no, they have a different aesthetic. They lost this aspect because there's no more superposition, but they also gained something. They traded part of their original aesthetic during the incorporation into the world of Minecraft. When in Minecraft, a part of their newly acquired, traded, if you will, aesthetic is the fact that they represent some stuff that is not to be seen anywhere within the game world. This adds a layer of mystery, of questioning, etc. When you see pixelated forms and skulls in the original paintings, you are meant to know that those things exist. The pixelated fire as fire in video games, and skulls as what exists in the human head. Even though they are represented in a way that's not exactly realistic. This is what Nietzsche called a semiotic representation, as opposed to a magic representation, where what is represented is supposed to be in itself what it is. Like ancient Greek statues, who, by representing gods, were the gods themselves. Now, when you see the paintings in the Minecraft world, and if you suspend your disbelief, intentionally forgetting the fact that you are not your avatar and that you in fact know about the world outside of Minecraft for immersion, you realize that many unknown elements in the paintings are not referring to anything that you can see or know that exists within the game's world. Some elements can be traced back to representation of some stuff in the game world, like the skull. The Hassel archers have them, but they don't look alike. And you haven't met any artist in this world, so the artistic act of semiotically representing something could not have been done. This mystery is part of the works of art's aesthetic in the game, and it is not in the original paintings. So again, one is not lacking, they simply are different art with different aesthetics. Another element that distinguishes them from their original counterparts is the fact that most of them are cropped or zoomed towards specific elements. I don't think that this transformation makes the painting in Minecraft completely unrelated works of art to the originals. However, I think that this transformation is not what transgresses the original aesthetic. They remain an incorporation of the original paintings in the game world. They are not because of that entirely new works of art. It is their ontological placement, which is existing inside a different world than ours, that changes partly their aesthetics. And I think that this is what is so interesting about this case of art within art. They are still independent works of art, just like the originals, yet their aesthetic, their theoretical atmosphere, like Danto would say, is different because of their containment in another work of art. Although unlike works of art from the third category, they lose their medium's integrity, they transcend their initial medium, yet remain works of art. Works of art with a partly different aesthetic, but at the same time, partly the same. Because they are, in their new context, still art. They are not fundamentally changed to fit a narrative. They don't have a new narrative context. So in a way, they represent a total transgression of what they were, yet they are still fundamentally the same as before their incorporation into the larger work of art. What they were and what they are now in the context is linked. Now, before we finish, there's another aspect of Minecraft's paintings that I think makes them ontologically interesting. It's the fact that they are not only works of art within a work of art, paintings in a video game. They are sometimes paintings of a video game inside a different video game. Can we talk about art within art within art? I would say so, but I think that it would be subject to another analysis. I have to finish this video eventually, so yeah, Minecraft's paintings are a weird art ontology case, one that I found extremely interesting and fun to analyze in this video, and I hope you enjoyed it too. If you can think of any other example of art within art occurrences that would fit the description of this fifth category, let me know in the comments. Thanks a lot for watching.